All right, welcome to episode 3 of the JP Pod. Today I wanted to start off with the Trump court case. Today there was a small victory for Trump. The bond was, excuse me 1 second. The bond was lowered from, I believe it was $450 million or something like that to $175 million. This is a small victory for Trump. Hopefully this is a sign that New York is realizing how absolutely ridiculous this case is. I mean, you have a fraud case where nobody lost money and everybody benefited from the situation. So it's lawfare at its finest. You have millionaires like Kevin O'Leary pointing out how this will cause investors to not want to invest in New York. The case, not this particular victory for Trump with the bond. And that this whole case will shake investors' trust in the U.S. I tend to agree with this. I mean, when you have fraud cases for something that's beneficial for everybody and nobody lost money off of it, I mean, it kind of deviates from the whole point of fraud to begin with. It sets a weird precedent of what even fraud is in the first place. I mean, legally, you could say that Trump committed fraud, but fraud obviously is more towards people losing money and getting screwed, not something that benefits everybody and everybody gets more money from it. So it's lawfare at its finest, and the whole lawfare that is going on from the left with Trump is really it's a big sign of a failing democracy. And you know, the left likes to talk about non-democratic countries like Russia, and they use democracy as an excuse to have wars like Ukraine versus Russia, that Ukraine is fighting for democracy, and this is a democrat. I mean, it's been the U.S.'s calling card ever since like wars like Vietnam. They use democracy as a calling card to intervene in foreign wars and fight countries through proxies like Ukraine without having to directly fight those countries, and using democracy as the calling card and as the reason for it, and that we have to protect democracy. It's such a blanket statement that they throw on everything that it's what they're saying with Trump and how Trump can't be back in office. We have to protect democracy. You know, democracy. We have to uphold democracy not only in our own country but worldwide. But yet we have lawfare where we're throwing our political opponents in jail over fraud cases where it's not even really fraud. Everybody benefited from it. And you see it in Georgia, and these absolutely ridiculous cases that they're trying to formulate against Trump to try to hurt his image, even though it appears that every time one of these cases happens, he gets more support and he goes up in the polls because people are realizing what they're doing. They don't want him in office, so it's making them support him and like him even more. So their strategy is failing. The classified documents case is a perfect example of an absolutely ridiculous case they're trying to pin on Trump. I mean, I wouldn't be able to say this because I don't have the experience, but people who have been around DC for their whole life, who know this stuff, like Tucker Carlson have pointed out that everybody who's been around politics and politicians for an extended period of time knows that everybody has done this to a certain extent, including Joe Biden, which has come to light in the recent impeachment case. So it's not just Trump that does this. And it was at a very minimal level, by the way, may I add. So they're nitpicking and they're reaching and they're trying to find anything to pin on Trump to hurt his image and use names of crimes like fraud and try to make it look, I mean, you just look at the headline and say Trump committed fraud. That would make you think the situation is a lot worse than it actually is. So it's very strategic and it's hurtful to democracy. Whenever we go towards the route of throwing our political opponents in jail, we don't become any better than Russia. At least Putin won this election without having any of his political opponents in jail. I mean, obviously, I'm not stupid enough to think that it was a free and fair election. Obviously, there's corruption in Russia's elections, and if you speak out against Putin as a Russian citizen, you're putting your life in danger to a certain extent. I mean, like Navalny. So obviously I'm not stupid enough to think that Russia is a perfect beacon of democracy, but we claim to be the beacon of democracy worldwide, and yet we're throwing our political opponents in jail, or trying to. So we don't become any better than the countries we like to smear and say that we're protecting countries like Ukraine against Russia because Russia hates democracy. And yet what we're doing within our own borders is totally anti-democracy. I mean, it is election meddling to a certain extent. Trying to fabricate cases to keep your political opponents off the ballot. And I haven't even mentioned the case in Colorado where they tried to keep him off the ballot for the insurrection claim. I mean, look, there's a definition for insurrection, okay? And this does not fall into that definition legally at all. Trump didn't lead an insurrection. He didn't call for people to barge into the Capitol and change the vote and stop the vote from happening to keep him in office. And I'm not even going to go down into the January 6th rabbit hole with the FBI agents in the field that day, which was over 200, by the way, supposedly, according to Republicans who have overseen the case. But there's a definition of insurrection. This doesn't fall into it. They're trying to use loopholes and legal words, and well, technically you could say, it's absurd, and it's really sad to see because our democracy is truly at stake against the Democrats, and the Democrats are trying to say it's at stake against Republicans. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Anybody who's paying attention can see what's going on. Anybody with common sense can see what's going on. They're trying to keep Trump from being able to run for presidency. This is not a fight for democracy. This is not, we're trying to protect democracy. You have to protect democracy. Our country will no longer be democratic if Trump is in office again. Oh no, we've got to stop him. But yeah, they're the ones trying to throw him in jail. And the hypocrisy in that we're trying to throw our political opponent in jail to protect democracy is hilarious. So keep that in mind as you see these Trump cases go forward. What's really going on? This is not a trying to protect people who are hurt by Trump's fraud, even though, like I said, people, nothing but benefits from the fraud, right? So keep that in mind when you see, I mean, this is not going to end. It's only March of an election year, and if you notice, they're trying many different tactics. One doesn't work, they go to another. One doesn't work, they go to another. They try to get them off the ballot in countries based off insurrection, and the Supreme Court shut that down. All right, now they got to go to another. They go on to the fraud case. They're trying to find any little nitpicky case, the classified documents. All right, well, then that doesn't work, and you got to look at what are they going to try next. And, you know, if you go down that rabbit hole, you could come up with some very dark assumptions of what they may try next. I'm not going to go down there yet. But you have to wonder, what are they going to try? What else is in their game plan? If this fraud case doesn't come to fruition, like I don't think it will, I don't think anything they will try will work to keep Trump from running for presidency. Nothing's going to work. So it'll be interesting to see what they try next. I'm curious to see what else is in their back pocket to what they're going to try to keep Trump off the ballot, but we'll see. Never underestimate the left's ability to go above and beyond to try to complete their agenda. So we'll see what happens. Next, I wanted to talk about the Russian response to the terrorist attacks. The terrorists have been caught. They were in court. They were in court for obviously the terrorist attacks, but they still had the plastic bags around their neck from the torturing sessions. Their faces were swollen. One guy was unconscious. He had to be wheeled in a wheelchair. He wasn't even awake. So the trials were set for May. These were just kind of setting the trial dates and such. They'll be kept in detention until May. There's also some possible massive bombing runs to take place in Ukraine. Ukraine was expecting this over the weekend. It didn't really take place. There were about 14 Russian bombers in the air. I believe it was Saturday night or Friday night. I can't remember. And Ukraine's whole country was on alert. Nothing really happened. Those bombers had nuclear capabilities, by the way. Nothing really happened of that yet. There were some bombings from Crimea that took place in response. But there hasn't really been a widespread, massive bombing run like there was expected. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it does happen eventually. There will be a big response eventually. It may not be as dramatic as tactical nukes, and I hope it doesn't, but I do think there will be a widespread, big throttle, probably one like we haven't seen yet in this war, in response to these terrorist attacks. Putin addressed the nation today, the nation of Russia, obviously blaming Ukraine. He also mentioned that the U.S. is trying to convince everyone, including other nations, that Ukraine had nothing to do with it. And then asked a very practical and valid question, I would think. Then why were the terrorists caught fleeing to Ukraine? And why was there a set window set for them to cross the border? I think that's a very valid question. If Ukraine had nothing to do with it, why are these supposed Islamic terrorists fleeing to Ukraine of all countries? You would think they would flee elsewhere, back to the Middle East, towards that direction, not directly to Ukraine. So that's a key illustration of Ukraine likely had something to do with it. It's really troubling to see. I mean, I talked about this last episode. I went to in depth about the terrorist attacks last episode. The U.S.'s response, like I mentioned, is pretty fishy, especially with their advance notice of potential terrorist attacks, and then mentioned in the notice the exact places that the terrorist attack did take place, like theaters and concerts and malls. I would keep an eye on Russia's rhetoric going forward. Obviously, anybody could have predicted that Putin was going to blame Ukraine, especially when the terrorists were caught fleeing back to Ukraine. I mean, I think that's very valid. I mean, if the terrorists who commit attacks are fleeing back to a country that you're at war with, what would any logical person conclude from that? I mean, there's no conclusive evidence yet, at least public. Russia and Putin may have evidence that they're not sharing, that Ukraine and the U.S. directly ordered the attacks. He mentioned in the speech that he is certain that Ukraine had something to do with this, but he said that he wants to know who ordered the attacks. And that's really concerning, because you can allude from that he's alluding to the U.S. and the U.S. having involvement in this, that the U.S. ordered Ukraine to have these attacks take place. I mean, even if he's not alluding to the U.S., he's alluding to Ukraine possibly ordering the attacks, and we've been supporting Ukraine, so we will kind of be meddled into that, and NATO. So if the rhetoric continues to putting the blame on the U.S. and NATO on top of Ukraine, things could get dicey. Things could get a little suspect. I do not think Russia will initiate a widespread conflict with NATO and the United States with nuclear war or such, but we'll be pushed further toward that edge, and things will get more. That possibility and the likelihood of that happening will only rise, because Russia will respond militarily, obviously, and when bombs start dropping and stuff starts happening, there's more of a chance for crap to happen that could escalate things even more into a wider conflict. Somebody gets killed, like a Zelensky or such, and that could probe NATO or the U.S. to feel inclined to get directly involved. Like I said, I do not think Russia will initially strike NATO or strike the U.S., but obviously a military action one that hasn't even been reached yet in the war in terms of widespread bombings that were mentioned to possibly take place. I think it eventually will take place. I think they need time to strategically, figure that all out. But if that happens, even if it's not a direct strike at the U.S. or NATO, the likelihood of a wider conflict only rises, and rises quite dramatically, especially if you have a bombings run or a military action that hasn't been reached yet in the war. The trending is going upwards in terms of likelihood for a bigger conflict to take place. And, it's just really worrying when Putin mentions the U.S. and possibly ordering or having something to do with terrorist attacks like this, which have taken the lives of 140 people in Russia. It's very troubling because the Russian rhetoric is leaning towards the route of putting the blame on the U.S. on top of Ukraine in this. So it's worrying, and it's something to watch. It will be interesting to see if these terrorists even make it alive to the trials. I mean, there's videos of them during interrogation cutting off their ears, feeding it to them, other torturous methods that were horrible, but these people deserve it. I mean, these animals that go in and kill 140 Russians, innocent civilians like that. It was interesting. France also raised its terrorist attack potential or warning. It was I can't remember the name of the exact level, but it was the highest level possible. So you have to wonder what's that all about. I don't think they were expecting a terrorist attack from Russia, but it's I guess had something to do with the Islamic terrorists that committed those acts in Russia. So maybe not Russia, but I don't know. There wasn't much beyond the reasoning of why, but it was interesting to see that France was expecting a terrorist attack at the highest level of threat. So that's something to watch. Will there be widespread terrorist attacks throughout Europe? Was Moscow just the first thing? If Ukraine directly wasn't involved and these were just Islamic terrorists, if this was just ISIS, and France is having its terrorist attack threat level at the highest point, at the highest level, was Moscow just kind of the first European city, and there's about to be a widespread terrorist attacks across Europe? I'm not sure how likely that is, but it's something to keep an eye on. So, like I said, something like this could be... Putin has an eventual breaking point. His, I believe, is a lot harder to reach than others, but that breaking point exists. Every leader has a breaking point where enough's enough, right? Could this be that breaking point if he eventually finds out that the United States has something to do with it, or Ukraine, and kind of meddles the U.S. with Ukraine and that, and they respond to us and NATO on top of Ukraine? Will this attack or something like this cause him to break? I mean, he's held restraint throughout the whole Ukrainian war with NATO's involvement and the U.S.'s involvement. I mean, it's blatant. It's not just we're supporting them, we're keeping the war alive. Ukraine could not keep fighting this war. I mean, the war would have been over a long time ago. They're using primarily our weapons. They haven't even received the F-16s yet that we promised them. So, I mean, we're keeping the war alive. So that is direct involvement. Putin has held restraint to not launch into a wider conflict and is still open to peace negotiations. But when stuff like this happens, especially if the United States and NATO was involved in this, that doesn't help the cause of reaching any peace negotiations. This may be something that causes Putin to say enough's enough. Offers are off the table. This is war. And that, I don't have to tell you, that is the start of a World War III, essentially. So where is that breaking point for Putin? When is enough enough? When has he seen enough to where he launches it to a wider conflict. I think, like I said, that breaking point is going to be very difficult to reach for Putin, who's held great restraint in all of this. But you have to wonder, I mean, he's human. He has a breaking point. When you have 140 of his own citizens dying from terrorist attacks, and somebody who loves his own citizens like Putin does, like I said in the last episode, that's the whole reason he launched the Ukrainian war, is he felt like his own citizens who held Russian values, Russian culture, spoke Russian, were in Ukraine, and he was claiming back his own people in his own eyes. When somebody loves his own people that much, and something like this happens that kills 140 innocent civilians, is something like that the breaking point where he's had enough? God hoped that he does hold restraint, because if he doesn't and launches a wider conflict, things will get very, very dangerous, and that is a World War situation. So, very dangerous situation going on. I mean, there has been one ever since the war started, but when things like this happen, it only raises the likelihood of a wider conflict taking place, and the world is on tipping point. One little match to start it all, and everybody's in a war. Everybody's involved in this. So let's just pray that Putin continues to hold restraint, and also pray that whoever is behind these attacks, that justice be, whether it be legally or militarily, that justice be reached, and that things like this won't happen again, especially in Europe or in Russia. And so the UN voted for a ceasefire today. They adopted a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. This was the first time they got enough votes to adopt a resolution for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, a permanent ceasefire. The U.S. didn't veto a ceasefire for the first time. They didn't vote for it. They abstained from the vote, but that when you vetoed every single one and then you don't veto one, I mean, that's pretty much a vote for it in the people's eyes. Even if they didn't directly vote for it, they abstained from the vote. They didn't veto it. The U.S. said that this can begin when a hostage exchange begins. When you look at the trend that's going, this is trending towards a certain direction. The U.S. and President Biden is openly condemning Netanyahu, an ally who's in a war, and alluded to potentially looking for new leadership in Israel, somebody that will bow down to the U.S. and do what it says. God forbid another country make its own decisions for its own best interest. This is trending towards if you're pro-Israel, by the way, this doesn't mean that you think that Israel's done everything correctly. Innocent civilians have died that shouldn't have died, and I condemn that. But you look who started the war in the first place. It was Hamas who killed innocent civilians and took hostages, right? And you look who is putting efforts in to save innocent civilians, who's dropping leaflets and having innocent civilians trying to get them to leave, and who's stopping them. Hamas is stopping them, and Hamas has killed the innocent civilians to start with without any regard to get them out of harm's way. I've already talked on and on about that. You can watch my previous videos on that if you want to. But what I want to illustrate in this is the trend of the U.S. abandoning Israel. When you're condemning an ally's leader while they're at war, what are we doing, right? Like, either you support them or you don't. You don't have to support everything, but if you're going to have Israel's side in this, you can't condemn their leader, right? I mean, you have to support them if they're an ally, like Israel is our ally, or that we claim for them to be, so then we need to support them, right? What does a ceasefire accomplish? Hamas is still standing, right? So you're essentially saying that Hamas has a right to continue to be on Israel's border and exist how it is. Obviously, they've been weakened with the war, but they're still there. The threat is still there. Years from now, they can rebuild to a point to where October 7th happens again. They've proven that they can't exist on Israel's border unchecked and there be no threat to Israel and its own citizens, right? And not only Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have Iran, who all these countries are Iran's proxies. You have the Houthis in Yemen at the bottom of the Red Sea. So these nations are surrounding Israel, and Israel forever has been surrounded by enemies. But when you have Hamas right on its border, and Hezbollah, who is a much bigger threat, they're much stronger, much larger, and that has been yet to be dealt with. I mean, there's been little rocket shots back and forth, not really doing much. I feel like a war with Hezbollah eventually will spark and start. I'm surprised it hasn't already. But Hamas has proven with its actions they cannot exist on Israel's border and Israeli citizens not be at risk. So what does the ceasefire accomplish? Obviously, it saves innocent civilians' lives, which I am for. But at the same time, the whole point of the war to start with was to eliminate Hamas and eliminate that threat. Even if it's not forever and they will rebuild, to wipe them to the bottom, to where they have to rebuild from the bottom to the top, at least that threat is gone for a longer period of time than if you just stop while Israel's ahead right now. Obviously, Israel and its defense officials want to go into Rafah for a reason. And there's been arguments that Israel forcing the Rafah citizens to up and move unwillingly is a war crime, which it is if you have them move there permanently. And I don't think the citizens will unwillingly want to move for a period of time when war is going to be taking place and then come back when it's safe. Who in their right mind wouldn't want to get out of harm's way if war is coming to your area? Especially when Hamas is there and could potentially start building bases. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there already is bases under civilian areas, under houses, under schools, under hospitals. So to get to them, the civilians need to be out of harm's way so the civilians don't die. What civilian, unless if they're trying to be a martyr, would not want to get out of harm's way if Israel is warning them, like, look, we're about to come in, we're about to eliminate the Hamas presence in Rafah. So I don't really buy that. I don't really buy Israel's not forcing them to move permanently, and they're not forcing them to move very far. They're still in Gaza. Just move them north, out of harm's way, and then you can come back when it's safe. I'm not really buying the war crime narrative in that. The Israeli defense minister was in D.C. when this vote took place and passed, and obviously it was pretty funny. He posted a video in front of the Capitol, I believe it was, or the White House. It may have been. It was either the Capitol or the White House, condemning the vote, which the U.S. didn't veto, abstained from voting. So it was a weird little video. He was in front of the Capitol while saying this, and then canceled all his meetings in D.C. Is there a bigger rift or a bigger divide between the Israel government and the U.S. taking place? Will this become Israel fully saying, we don't want your help anymore, the U.S.? We're going to conduct our military objectives without you because you're just becoming an obstacle in this. The U.S. is just trying to do nothing but stop them from completing their objectives at this point. And, I'm not against temporary ceasefires for hostage exchange and aid to be provided to innocent civilians to be monitored so Hamas doesn't get that aid, and then the fighting to continue so that Hamas can be eliminated. There's no the no negotiation argument for me is Hamas being able to exist. Hamas cannot exist as it is as a terrorist organization, which some people don't even recognize them as that, which is crazy. I mean, you barge into another country's borders, rape their women, kill their babies, and take hostages, and you're not a terrorist organization. The whole point of Hamas's existence is to eliminate Israel. It's not to promote stability in Gaza. It's not to promote wealth in Gaza. It's not to move Gaza upwards to promote them getting wealthier. It's to eliminate Israel. The governing body, the people in charge in Gaza, is a terrorist organization, which its whole focus is to eliminate another country. So Gaza will not thrive as long as Hamas is in power. I'm not oblivious to the fact that I believe there's a poll about 70% of the people in Gaza support Hamas and voted them in, but Hamas is not good for Gaza. Hamas is not good for Palestinians. If the Palestinian people want to thrive and move forward as a group of people, then they shouldn't be for Hamas. And if you're for the Palestinians to thrive and to grow as a group of people, you shouldn't be for Hamas either. Because all they do is keep their people poor, steal their stuff, steal their aid that is given to them, steal their resources, steal their food, steal their fuel, and use it for themselves and keeping them poor. And then they use them as human shields for the PR front. So they're putting innocent civilians in harm's way for its own benefit. Hamas is not for Palestinians and for Gaza. Hamas is for Hamas. Hamas is for Iran. Hamas is for terror. And Hamas is for wiping Israel off the face of the earth. A group like that should not have a right to exist. A group like that should be eliminated. And the country that was victim to this group's ravage acts and ravage war crimes should be allowed to defend itself and defend its own citizens and eliminate that threat from its own border. Don't even get me started on Hezbollah, which is just Hamas but bigger and stronger. The opposition to Israel is growing and getting bigger worldwide. And it's troubling because we've forgotten about October 7th. October 7th has been completely removed from our memories as a globe. Everybody. We're supposed to be Israel's biggest ally. And we're not letting them conduct these military actions to eliminate Hamas. Is troubling, and I really hope Israel continues to do what it's doing and stand strong on what it needs to do. Like I said before, this doesn't mean I'm for innocent civilians dying, but you gotta look who you're pointing the finger at here. Who is not letting those citizens leave? Who's putting them in harm's way? Hamas. So the bottom line is Hamas, who is in charge of Gaza, is not for the Palestinians. The Palestinians will not grow and thrive with Hamas in power. So if you claim to be for Hamas or for Palestinians, but also be for Hamas, you're a hypocrite. And what you really should say is you're anti-Semitic and you hate Israel. Because if you're really for the Palestinians, you would want a group in charge that doesn't start a war with a much stronger country like Israel and then put those people in harm's way. If Hamas was for the Palestinians, they would let them leave and get out of harm's way instead of lining up trucks and shooting at them, keeping them from leaving. So if you're for the Palestinians, you can't be for Hamas because Hamas isn't for the Palestinians. So there needs to be a realization here. If you're supporting a terrorist group like Hamas, you're not supporting Palestine. You're supporting terror and a group that wants Israel off the face of the earth. There's a divide. There's a separation between Hamas and the Palestinians. Hamas is for Hamas and terror, not for the Palestinians. So we should push to have that threat eliminated so you can put somebody in charge who is for the Palestinians, for peace, for progress, for wealth, to start moving forward as a nation, not for Palestine, instead of a group who just wants terror. Palestine will not thrive, and it's not Israel's fault. It's Hamas, because Hamas is the one in charge there. And they're keeping the Palestinians from thriving by stealing all their resources. So to be for Hamas is to be against Israel at the bottom line, because Hamas does not promote Palestinian growth. They promote the destruction of Israel. So there needs to be a switch there. Just say you're against Israel, because that's what you're saying when you're for Hamas. You can't say you're for Palestinians and for Hamas, because that's oxymoronic. It'll be interesting to see how, I don't know how the UN is going to go about trying to enforce this ceasefire. I'm not against a hostage exchange and a temporary ceasefire, but the war cannot stop because Israel is this close to winning it. And I think going into Rafah is one of the final steps. Let them finish the war and completely destabilize Hamas so that they can't do something like October 7th again. And to protect Israel's innocent civilians who died on that day and keep that from happening again. I really hope the U.S. stops this trend. I believe this is a politically motivated move by them to try to gain back the votes from its younger supporters, because this wasn't an issue before an election year, and now it's becoming an issue to support Israel. I think people within the Biden administration are realizing, like, look, we're losing our young voters over this issue in Israel. And when you say young voters, we're losing the anti-Semitic vote. We got to have the anti-Semitic vote because that's a priority to them for some reason. We have to continue to support Israel to do its job, period. And if we claim for them to be an ally like we do all the time, well, we can't be against their own leader in a time of war. And if you are, do it behind closed doors. Don't do it publicly. That's disgusting. To openly bash an allied leader during a time of war instead of standing by their side is disgusting. And not vetoing this act for the first time is, I'm not saying, a good trend going on here with the United States concerning Israel. So fingers crossed that flips. I don't think it will. It kind of seems like this trend is going to keep going forward, but we'll see what happens. All right, that's all the topics for today. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back tomorrow with another video. See you next time.